Hi and welcome to Big Picture Walks, Stay-at-Home Edition. Today I'm gonna talk about institutions, technology, and economic growth. Economists have put forward many theories and ideas about fundamental and proximate sources of economic growth. The working model for thinking about these issues can be like this. What are the sources of long-run growth? Okay, let's start with growth itself, and let's think about the main reasons why an economy can grow. So the proximate reasons you can think about are basically factors of production. If you have more factors of production, you'll possibly produce more. So capital, human capital, efficiency with which the factors of production are used, distance to the technological frontier, which is how quick you are in adopting the newest technologies. So these are basically the proximate sources of growth. But economists, growth theorists in particular, agree that proximate sources of growth is not the end of the story, and we would like to understand what are the fundamental reasons for economic growth. And here I would group the factors into three groups: geography, technology, and institutions. And each of them, you see, is with a question mark because there is an ongoing debate about the links of these factors and the pace of economic growth. And moreover, as you can see here, it's also likely that these fundamental sources of growth are actually related to one another. And moreover, I drew arrows here as if it was clear that this is the exact direction of causality, but it doesn't have to be like this. In fact, many of those factors can actually be caused and not be a source of growth. For example, you can think that institutions are just a normal good, and if you have a more advanced economy, a more affluent economy, you just can afford to have better institutions. Also, there can be a link between these three things, and so the question is pretty much open. So when I'm talking about institutions, what I mean is rule of law, democracy, universal rights, freedom of speech, control of corruption, control of violence. So these sort of institutions that are frequently discussed in the literature as potentially conducive to economic growth. And now, there's clearly a positive correlation. You can say that countries that have rule of law, that respect universal rights of their citizens, tend to be richer. So there is a clear correlation in the cross-section, but the question is if this is really a causal link. There is a chicken and egg problem, and maybe once you get sufficiently rich, you can afford to have these good institutions, but maybe it's not institutions themselves that lead to good growth outcomes. So for sure what we can say is that we know about the causality when the institutions are really bad. So if you think about places like Zimbabwe, like North Korea, if you think about the actions that have been taken during the Second World War, or in China under Mao, the Great Leap Forward, or in other countries, or the wrong side of the Iron Curtain in the second half of the 20th century. So you can see that you can make institutions sufficiently bad that economic growth will for sure suffer. But it's probably, the key question that we would like to answer here is, can this work the other way around? Okay, can it be that good institutions could help growth? Yuval Noah Harari says that politicians have very limited capacity to do good and unlimited capacity to do harm. And I agree with this. I agree that it's clear how bad institutions can lead to bad outcomes, but it's not at all clear how good institutions lead to good outcomes in terms of economic growth in particular. I would also like to add that you may have an important link between technology and institutions, and I have a working model for that. This is my working model for the link between technology and institutions. So what I think is that technology determines the maximum available scale of state at each given moment in time. And you can draw it in this way, as you see here, using two axes, inclusiveness and state strength. Inclusiveness means the degree to which the state takes into account the well-being and local control of its citizens in making decisions, whereas state strength refers to centralization of power, strength of military power, and coercive capacity. My claim here is that there is something like a maximum scale of states, and there is a trade-off. So the more inclusive you would like to be, the more difficult it is to maintain a certain level of strength. So you have this trade-off. But the level of the curve, like whether it's here or up here or maybe even further, depends on the current state of technology. So, of course, every ruler of a country would like its country to be infinitely strong and infinitely inclusive, but this is just not possible. And so think about, for example, like 500 BC, that was a time where you had a very big empire, so-called Achaemenid Empire in modern-day Iran, and it spread both eastwards and westwards to cover most of the today's Middle East, and that was a strong empire. It had like 20 to 50 million people, which at that time was like staggering percentage, 30-40% of the whole population in the world. And at the same time, you had Athens. And Athens are famous for being the first democracy. And Athens was home to about 300,000 people. So you see this trade-off already. Okay, either you can have a huge empire which is centralized, strong, very despotic, or you can have something like Athens where you have direct democracy. But then, of course, the scale must be much, much lower. Now, of course, as technology progressed, countries could have become both more inclusive and stronger. And for example, if you think about the current days, you can probably say that you have this frontier as given by places like China, which is a very strong country, which has probably much more inclusiveness than the ancient Achaemenid Empire, but okay, not that much by today's standards. Or you can have a much more inclusive society like the ones in the European Union, but then of course comes at the cost of relatively less state strength. Over the centuries, the maximum scale of state has been growing, and that has been because of technological progress. So technological progress eases information collection and transmission, and therefore lowers surveillance costs. Technological progress reduces costs and expands the capacity of bureaucracy. And most generally, technological progress fuels economic growth, and so it facilitates the pursuit of local control maximization by people within states. Right? So you have these channels through which technology makes it more and more possible for states to grow in size. And accordingly, you see this development over centuries. First, you would have hunter-gatherer tribes. Then, after the agricultural revolution, you had first centralized states. You had city-states in the Mesopotamian region. You had centralized empires with absolute rulers, notably the Egyptian empire. Then you had, after the scientific revolution, you had colonial empires, such as, the British Empire, for example. And eventually, now you have representative democracies, and you also have supranational entities. After the Second World War, we are observing that some part of state power is delegated to supranational entities. The European Union is probably the best example. The trade-off between state strength and inclusiveness arises because of the following forces. Well, too much state strength leads to oppression, and too much inclusiveness leads a state to be frail and indecisive. And if a state is too oppressive, it makes it vulnerable to revolutions and various forms of resistance and centrifugal forces. On the other hand, if a country is too inclusive, it makes it vulnerable to external conquests and internal coup d'etat. So basically, countries reach the frontier through growth, through unification, through conquest, but also it must be mentioned that multiple levels of governance may coexist at the same time. Currently, the situation is the following. You have multiple levels of governance, but the key player in the field is the national government. The national government is the major source of power, but it of course delegates some of the power, and either it's top-down delegation from the national government to federal states, provinces, townships, various local authorities, or you may also have bottom-up delegation towards supranational entities, and the best example here is the European Union, but also you have some specialized supranational entities that deal with certain narrowly defined policy areas. My opinion on the role of institutions in explaining economic growth is that it is not a true fundamental source of growth. However, it is a good explanation why nations fail. Nations can fail because they can become failed states, like, for example, modern-day Somalia. They can also fail because of being overly oppressive regimes, like modern-day North Korea. Historically, it can be argued that institutions may have been an important reason why the Middle Ages lasted for so long. So, for example, religious constraints imposed on research, science, experimentation, and so on could have been one of the reasons why it took so long until Europe, in that case, had the scientific revolution. Also, institutions could have been the reason why in the 14th, 15th century, China, under the Ming Dynasty, didn't have a scientific revolution of its own, even though at that time it was the most populous region of the world and most technologically advanced. Turning back to this figure, let me once again look at the candidates for fundamental sources of long-run growth: geography, technology, and institutions. And geography, we know for sure, was one of the key determinants of the timing of the agricultural revolution. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond are an excellent discussion of why geography, and particularly biogeography, determined who was first into farming and who had to remain hunter-gatherers for next millennia. Technology is likely conducive to all technological revolutions over the course of the human history. I mean, it's almost tautological that technology leads to technological revolutions, but it has indeed underlined the Industrial Revolution, for example, And so clearly I would say technology must be taken as one of the key reasons for long-run growth. Now, what about institutions? And my argument here is that institutions, as a fundamental cause of long-run growth, don't seem a good theory in my perspective. So first of all, there is a clear link between technology and institutions. So maybe, some decisions, okay, so where your country will be along a certain frontier, this is not determined by technology, of course. It is a mixture of some idiosyncratic factors and some local characteristics of a given region or society, but it's clear that the capacity to improve in both dimensions of state strength and inclusiveness at the same time is a technologically determined issue. So in this regard, I would say institutions are in a way secondary to technology. The progress in terms of distance from the origin is technological, not institutional. And moreover, there is this possibility that you may just achieve better institutions thanks to higher levels of economic development. What should we expect in the future after the digital revolution? So digital technologies for sure improve information transmission, information collection, and because of this reason, it seems they have a potential to push the frontier in terms of state capabilities upward. So we have technological underpinnings for potentially growing scale of states. We have a better capacity of state bureaucracy, and these technologies help people pursue their local control. So in my perspective, we could expect that the maximum scale of state is growing thanks to digital technologies. The economy these days is global. The digital sphere is fully global. The internet is a global village. We can instantly communicate with people all around the world. Politics, on the other hand, are stubbornly national. So we are still thinking in terms of this mindset that the national government is the main source of power, and it can potentially delegate some of the power to supranational entities, but it's them who make the key decisions. It's the mindset that lingers from the industrial era when the maximum scale of state was lower. So what should we expect in the digital era? As the frontier, which I mentioned before, moves upward, we could arguably expect expansion in the size of the key decision-making entity. Where does this lead? And how can change happen? Historically, increases in the scale of state happened through growth, through unification, and through conquest. So we don't know, of course, what will happen in the future. It's hard to predict, especially the future. Still, the prophecies that some authors produce are ranging from digital dictatorships, and that's the idea of Yuval Noah Harari. He says that thanks to the developments in artificial intelligence, rulers of states could be more and more able to increase state strength and basically change the political system into a dictatorship, which is facilitated to a large extent by digital technologies. And okay, you already see first examples of that in China. You see that you have this social credit, social status points. You have a lot of surveillance, which is also run to a large extent by artificial intelligence algorithms. Who knows, maybe this is the direction in which the whole world will go. On the other hand, you can also have a prophecy by Cesar Hidalgo And he says, well, you can have a lot of inclusiveness even though your cognitive capacity is bounded and the complexity of problems over which you would have to decide is growing. And you can have that by automating a lot of the political process. So he says, okay, so now it's not top-down enforcement of the rule using AI, it's like empowerment going bottom-up thanks to AI, because AI agents can serve the rulers, but also the AI agents can serve the citizens. So, well, depending on certain institutional decisions, okay, the fact that the frontier for the maximum scale of state goes up, you can end up going strongly towards state strength. You can also end up going strongly towards inclusiveness. What will happen? We don't know. In the course of the human history, we had also examples of empires which fell. So there have been episodes in the history where the maximum size of a country or a state of an empire that was present in the world rapidly declined. Take, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire. How can we reconcile this with the claim that technological progress always pushes the frontier ahead and increases the maximum scale of state? Well, one of the possible explanations could be that, in fact, some states can temporarily grow beyond the sustainable maximum scale of state. It may have well been that at that time, you have to keep in mind that there was a lot of population growth within the Roman Empire. So as time passed, the Roman Empire, even if it did not progressively conquer further territories, it still grew in terms of the size of the population. It could have been that at some point just the sheer number of people within the empire grew too big to be sustainable. And of course there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. I leave that to historians, okay, I'm not an expert in that. Nevertheless, I don't think this contradicts my theory. I think this is an example that temporarily you could even have entities beyond the maximum sustainable scale of state. It's just sooner or later these sort of entities would have to disintegrate. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe.